Welcome to this journey into the shadows of America's past, where respectability and horror walked hand in hand through the corridors of a Vermont mansion. I'm your guide through these forgotten archives, and tonight we're opening a case file that authorities tried to bury for decades. Before we descend into this investigation, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you alone? Are the lights on? This matters because what we're about to explore together demands your full attention. This community, our haunted community, thrives on shared experiences of the unexplainable and the disturbing. The year is 1928. The place is Burlington, Vermont, a town of church steeples and maple-lined streets where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were currency more valuable than gold. Winter had settled over Lake Champlain like a burial shroud, and in a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, Dr. Everett Marsh was putting the finishing touches on what he called his life's work. Dr. Marsh was 52 years old that year, a respected forensic physician. He had served the community for nearly 3 decades. He had examined the dead, determined causes of death, signed certificates that allowed families to move forward with their grief. He was, by all accounts, a pillar of Burlington society. He collected rare medical instruments, gave lectures at the University of Vermont, and maintained an impeccable reputation. But on the night of March 15, 1928, when Sheriff James Thornton kicked down the basement door of the Marsh residence, he discovered something that would haunt him until his dying day, something that would force the state of Vermont to ask an impossible question: how long can a monster hide behind a medical degree? The investigation began not with Dr. Marsh, but with a young woman named Sarah Holloway, 24 years old, auburn-haired, training to become a nurse at Burlington Hospital. She had last been seen on March 12th, walking up the gravel path to the Marsh mansion, carrying her medical bag. She had been summoned, according to the note found in her boarding house room, to assist Dr. Marsh with cataloguing his medical collection. Sarah never returned. Her landlady, Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan, waited until the morning of March 14th before contacting authorities. Sarah was reliable, she insisted. Something was wrong. Sheriff Thornton initially dismissed the concern. Young women sometimes ran off with suitors, he reasoned, but Mrs. Brennan was persistent. She knew Sarah's character, she knew her dedication to her studies, and she knew with the certainty that only a woman who has raised 5 daughters can possess, that Sarah would never simply vanish. When Thornton finally agreed to visit the Marsh residence on the afternoon of March 15th, he found the good doctor cordial, if somewhat distracted. Yes, Miss Holloway had visited. No, she had stayed only a few hours. She had seemed troubled by something, Marsh explained, and had left rather abruptly around 9 in the evening. He assumed she had returned to her lodgings. But something in Marsh's demeanor troubled Thornton. The doctor's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. His eyes, usually sharp and clinical, seemed unable to focus. And there was a smell in the house, faint but unmistakable. Formaldehyde, preservation chemicals, far too strong for a simple medical collection. Thornton left, but he didn't leave convinced. He returned that evening with 2 deputies and a warrant. What they found in the basement of that mansion would become the subject of sealed police reports, psychiatric evaluations, and decades of horrified speculation. Because Dr. Everett Marsh wasn't just a collector of medical instruments, he was a collector of something far more disturbing, something that blurred the line between scientific preservation and unspeakable obsession. But to understand how a respected physician became Vermont's most disturbing criminal case, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when the boundaries of medical science were being pushed, when the study of death was considered both noble and necessary, and when one man's fascination with mortality would slowly, methodically, transform into something monstrous. This is the story of Dr. Everett Marsh. This is the story of his Macabre collection. And this is the story that Burlington, Vermont, has spent nearly a century trying to forget. To understand Dr. Everett Marsh, we must first understand the world that created him. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a peculiar time in American medical history, when the line between scientific inquiry and morbid fascination was dangerously thin. Everett Marsh was born in 1876 in Boston, Massachusetts, the only child of Jonathan Marsh, a pharmaceutical merchant, and Eleanor Marsh, a former schoolteacher. The Marsh family was comfortable, educated, and deeply invested in the progressive ideals of the era. Young Everett showed an early aptitude for the sciences, particularly biology and chemistry. His childhood notebooks, preserved in the Vermont Historical Society archives, show meticulous drawings of insects, pressed flowers, and detailed anatomical sketches that were remarkably sophisticated for a boy of 12. He attended Harvard Medical School, graduating in 1899 with honors. His thesis, titled Methods of Tissue Preservation in Forensic Examination, was praised by his professors as groundbreaking. Even then, Marsh was fascinated by death, by the processes of decay, by the challenge of stopping time itself in the tissues of the deceased. This fascination wasn't unusual for the era. The late Victorian period had witnessed an explosion of interest in death culture. Post-mortem photography was commonplace. Families posed with their deceased loved ones for final portraits. Mourning. Jewelry was crafted from the hair of the dead. Spiritualism promised communication beyond the grave. Death, in many ways, was not the taboo it would become in later decades. It was visible, present, and in some circles almost celebrated as a transition worth documenting. Dr. Marsh established his practice in Burlington in 1902 at the age of 26. He married Catherine Whitmore, the daughter of a prominent local judge, in 1903. By all accounts, it was a marriage of convenience rather than passion. Catherine was educated, refined, and came with the social connections that would ensure Marsh's acceptance into Burlington's elite circles. She was also, according to letters discovered much later, deeply unhappy. The couple had no children. Catherine's diary, found after the events of 1928, reveals that this was not by choice, but by Marsh's insistence. He claimed his work was too demanding, too consuming. He couldn't divide his attention between family and his calling. Catherine wrote, in 1910, Everett spends more time with the dead than with the living. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers I exist. But Marsh's professional reputation was impeccable. As Burlington's primary forensic physician, he worked closely with local law enforcement, determining causes of death in suspicious cases. He was called to testify in court proceedings. He gave lectures at the medical college. His collection of medical instruments and anatomical specimens became renowned throughout New England. Visiting physicians would tour his private museum, housed in the east wing of his mansion, and marvel at the comprehensiveness of his archives. The mansion itself was a sprawling Victorian structure, purchased in 1905 with money from Catherine's inheritance. 3 stories of gables and turrets, surrounded by 10 acres of wooded land. It sat far enough from Burlington proper to afford Marsh the privacy he claimed to need for his studies. The house had been built in 1870 by a lumber baron who had died bankrupt. Locals considered it unlucky, but Marsh saw only opportunity. The basement was extensive, the walls thick, the property isolated. He began expanding the basement in 1908, hiring workers from outside Burlington to avoid local gossip. He claimed he needed additional storage space for his growing collection. The workers later reported that they had been instructed to create a series of interconnected rooms, some with reinforced doors, some with ventilation systems, that seemed excessive for simple storage. In the years following, Marsh became increasingly reclusive. He still fulfilled his professional obligations, but his social engagements dwindled. Catherine attended church and social functions alone. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the mansion's basement windows at odd hours, sometimes burning until dawn. When asked, Marsh explained that he worked best at night, when the world was quiet and he could focus on his research. Then, in the winter of 1924, Catherine Marsh died suddenly. The official cause of death, as determined by Dr. Marsh himself, was heart failure. She was 48 years old. She was buried in the Marsh family plot at Lakeview Cemetery, a modest funeral attended by the dwindling circle of people who still associated with the increasingly strange doctor. After Catherine's death, Marsh's behavior grew even more peculiar. He hired no housekeeper to replace Catherine's domestic presence. He took his meals alone. He rarely left the mansion except for his official duties. The local postmaster noted that Marsh received frequent shipments from medical supply companies, always marked fragile and perishable. Burlington was a small community, bound by the rhythms of lake and season. People noticed when patterns changed. They noticed when Dr. Marsh stopped attending church entirely. They noticed when deliveries arrived at his mansion in the dead of night. They noticed, but in the manner of small towns everywhere, they chose not to ask too many questions. Dr. Marsh was respected. Dr. Marsh was educated. Dr. Marsh was above suspicion. This was the era of prohibition, of the first radio broadcasts, of Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight. America was modernizing, leaving behind the superstitions of the previous century. Science was king. Medicine was advancing. And in Burlington, Vermont, a man who understood the chemistry of death was building something in his basement that would challenge the very notion of scientific progress. By 1928, Dr. Marsh had been working on his collection for over 2 decades. He had perfected techniques of preservation that went far beyond standard embalming. He had studied the work of European anatomists, the controversial experiments of researchers who pushed ethical boundaries. He had become, in his own mind, an artist, and like all artists, he needed subjects. The question that would haunt investigators was simple. When did Dr. Everett Marsh cross the line from scientist to predator? When did preservation become possession? When did study become obsession? The answer, as we'll discover, might be more disturbing than anyone imagined, because the evidence suggests that Marsh had been crossing that line for years, slowly, methodically, hiding in plain sight behind his medical credentials and his social standing. And it took the disappearance of Sarah Holloway, one young nurse who never came home, to finally expose the truth that had been growing like a cancer in the basement of that Victorian mansion. The investigation into Sarah Holloway's disappearance began routinely enough, but it wouldn't stay routine for long. Sheriff James Thornton was a practical man, a veteran of the Great War who had seen enough death to be difficult to shock, but even he couldn't have anticipated what his decision to obtain a search warrant for the Marsh residence would uncover. On the evening of March 15, 1928, Thornton returned to the Marsh mansion with deputies Harold Keene and Robert Sullivan, along with a search warrant signed by Judge William Hartley. The warrant was specific: to search for any evidence related to the disappearance of Miss Sarah Holloway, including personal effects, correspondence, or any indication of her whereabouts. Dr. Marsh received them cordially, though his composure seemed brittle. He was wearing a long black coat despite being indoors, and his collar was buttoned to the top, unusual for a man in his own home. He offered no resistance to the search, claiming he had nothing to hide. He did, however, insist that certain areas of his collection were fragile and should be handled only under his supervision. Thornton assigned Deputy Keene to search the upper floors, while he and Sullivan focused on the ground floor and basement. The upper floors revealed little of interest beyond Catherine Marsh's preserved bedroom, untouched since her death 4 years earlier, and Everett's own sparse sleeping quarters. The ground floor held Marsh's official medical collection, the one he showed to visiting colleagues. Glass cases displayed antique surgical instruments, anatomical models in wax, Victorian medical texts bound in leather. Everything was meticulously labeled and organized. Everything was, on the surface, exactly what one would expect from a scholarly collector. But the basement was different. The door to the basement was reinforced, fitted with not one but 3 separate locks. Marsh explained this as necessary for temperature control and security. His most valuable specimens, he claimed, were kept below. He produced keys slowly, his hands trembling more noticeably now. The stairs descended into darkness. The smell that Thornton had noticed during his earlier visit was stronger here, almost overwhelming. Formaldehyde, yes, but something else underneath, something organic and wrong. Marsh switched on electric lights, a modern installation that seemed incongruous in the stone-walled basement. What they saw in that first room was disturbing but explainable. More medical specimens in jars, labeled with clinical precision. Organs preserved in solution. Skeletal remains arranged on tables. A photographer's darkroom in one corner, equipped for developing plates. This was the public basement, the one Marsh could explain and defend. But Deputy Sullivan, exploring the far wall, noticed something odd. An inconsistency in the stonework. A section that looked slightly newer than the rest, the mortar a different shade. Thornton approached. He rapped his knuckles against the stones. The sound was hollow. Marsh's demeanor changed instantly. His cordiality evaporated. He insisted they had seen enough, that they should leave, that this was harassment of a respected professional. But his panic only confirmed Thornton's suspicion that something behind that wall needed to remain hidden. It took them 20 minutes to breach the false wall, Marsh protesting the entire time, threatening legal action, claiming destruction of valuable research. And when the stones finally gave way, when they shone their flashlights into the darkness beyond, they found another set of stairs leading deeper into the earth. What came next would be documented in Sheriff Thornton's official report, though that report would be sealed by court order for the next 50 years. Deputy Keene, called down from his search upstairs, would later tell his wife that he wished he had never joined the sheriff's department. And Dr. Everett Marsh, standing at the top of those descending stairs, finally stopped protesting. He simply stood silent, watching them discover his life's work. The lower basement was extensive, far larger than should have been possible based on the mansion's footprint. Marsh had been excavating for years, creating a network of interconnected chambers carved directly into the bedrock beneath his property. Each chamber had been finished with wooden walls, proper lighting, and ventilation systems that drew air from concealed shafts leading to the surface. The first chamber they entered was a laboratory. Work tables held instruments of preservation, scalpels, syringes filled with unknown solutions, measuring devices, notebooks filled with chemical formulas, written in Marsh's precise hand. Photographs covered one wall, pinned in rows, but these weren't medical documentation. These were portraits, dozens of them, all of women, young women, all photographed post-mortem, arranged as if sleeping, dressed in white gowns, some decorated with flowers. Deputy Sullivan found the guest book on a side table. It was bound in black leather, and inside, each page dedicated to a single entry. Names, dates, physical descriptions, and at the bottom of each entry, a single word: preserved. There were 11 entries dating back to 1920. The second chamber was a gallery. Here, Marsh had created what he called his exhibition space. Glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, each containing carefully preserved anatomical specimens. But these weren't the standard medical specimens found in teaching hospitals. These were arrangements, compositions, artistic displays of human remains that served no educational purpose whatsoever. Tell me in the comments what you think Sheriff Thornton should have done at this moment. Should he have retreated to get more help? Should he have arrested Marsh immediately? What would you have done faced with this discovery? The third chamber was a morgue. Refrigeration units, primitive by modern standards, but sophisticated for 1928, lined two walls. Each unit was labeled with a number. Thornton opened the first unit, his hand shaking despite his wartime experience. Inside was a preserved female body, dressed in Victorian clothing, positioned as if asleep. He opened the second unit, another body, similarly preserved, the third, the fourth. Each time the same horrifying care in presentation, the same disturbing artistry. And then Thornton opened Unit 7. Sarah Holloway was alive. Barely conscious, hypothermic, weak from days without food or water, but alive. She had been sedated, dressed in a white gown, prepared for preservation. But Marsh hadn't completed his work. She had been interrupted by the investigation, by the sheriff's persistent questions, by the warrant that had forced Marsh to delay his final procedure. Deputy Keene would later say that finding Sarah alive was both the greatest relief and the most disturbing moment of his career, because it meant that at least one of the women in those refrigeration units might have been alive when Marsh began his preservation process. It meant that his collection wasn't just necrophilia, it was murder. Dr. Marsh didn't run. He didn't resist arrest. He simply stood in his laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, and said something that Thornton would never forget. "You don't understand. I was saving them. Death is theft, Sheriff. It steals beauty, memory, essence. I was preserving what time tries to destroy. I was creating something eternal." They brought Sarah Holloway out of that mansion on a stretcher, surrounded by blankets, barely responsive. They brought her to Burlington Hospital, where she would spend 6 weeks recovering physically and the rest of her life recovering mentally from what she had experienced in Everett Marsh's collection. And in the basement, they began the grim process of documenting everything they had found. Everything that Marsh had built. Everything that would force Burlington, Vermont, to confront the horrifying truth that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like respected physicians who attend lectures and collect antiques and live in Victorian mansions on the edge of town. But this was only the beginning of the investigation, because as authorities would soon discover, what they had found in Marsh's basement was just the visible portion of something far more extensive, far more disturbing, and far more carefully planned than anyone had imagined. The systematic cataloging of Dr. Marsh's collection took investigators 3 weeks. They worked in rotating shifts, no one able to spend more than a few hours at a time in those underground chambers without becoming physically ill. What they found challenged every assumption about what a single individual could accomplish in secret over the course of nearly a decade. Marsh had maintained meticulous records. His journals, 17 volumes in total, documented every aspect of his work with scientific detachment. He wrote in a clear, careful hand, describing his experiments in preservation, his chemical formulations, his techniques for maintaining tissue integrity long after death should have rendered it unrecognizable. But interspersed with the scientific notation were passages that revealed something deeper and more disturbing than mere intellectual curiosity. Marsh wrote about beauty, about the tragedy of decay, about his philosophical conviction that death was an error that could be corrected through proper application of chemical science. He wrote about his subjects not as victims, but as collaborators in his work, as if they had somehow consented to become permanent residents of his underground gallery. The Burlington County prosecutor, Martin Ashford, later described reading those journals as descending into the mind of someone who had created their own moral universe, completely divorced from any normal understanding of right and wrong. Marsh genuinely believed, that he was performing a service, that he was rescuing these women from the indignity of decomposition. The photographic archives were extensive. Marsh had documented everything with his camera, creating before and after portraits, process documentation, and what he called his memorial gallery. Some photographs dated back to 1918, suggesting his collection had begun even earlier than the 1920 date in his guest book. Forensic analysis of the photographs revealed something investigators hadn't initially noticed. Several of the subjects showed signs of distress in their before images. Bruising around the wrists and ankles, expressions that, while carefully posed, seemed to show fear in the eyes. These weren't women who had died naturally and then been acquired by Marsh for his preservation experiments. These were women he had taken, held, and ultimately killed. The guest book became the foundation of the criminal case against Marsh. Each entry corresponded to a missing person report filed somewhere in New England between 1920 and 1928. Young women, mostly traveling alone, mostly far from home. Women whose disappearances had been noted but never seriously investigated because transient young women disappearing wasn't unusual in that era. America was mobile after the Great War. People moved for work, for opportunity, for escape. Sometimes they simply vanished, and their families assumed they had chosen a new life elsewhere. Marsh had been selecting victims that society wouldn't immediately miss. Women without strong family connections, women passing through Burlington for work or study, women who trusted the respectable Dr. Marsh when he offered assistance or employment, or, in Sarah Holloway's case, an opportunity to learn from his renowned medical collection. The investigation into each name in the guest book would take months, but certain cases emerged as particularly tragic. Margaret Porter, 22, had been traveling to Montreal to join her fiancé when she stopped in Burlington in November 1921. Her fiancé reported her missing when she never arrived, but authorities assumed she had changed her mind about the marriage. Dolores Simmons, 19, had answered an advertisement for a housekeeper position in 1923. Her family in New York received one letter saying she had found good employment, then nothing. They assumed she was busy with her new life. Ruth Cavendish, 26, a widow trying to rebuild her life after losing her husband to influenza, had come to Burlington in 1925 seeking nursing work. She had written to her sister about meeting a distinguished doctor who might offer employment. She was never heard from again. Each name represented not just a victim, but a family's unresolved grief, questions that had haunted parents and siblings for years. And each name represented a moment when Dr. Everett Marsh had carefully selected, carefully planned, and carefully executed his next addition to the collection. The technical sophistication of Marsh's preservation methods shocked the medical examiners brought in from Boston to analyze his work. He had gone far beyond standard embalming techniques, developing a multi-stage process that involved arterial injection of custom chemical compounds, followed by immersion in preservative solutions, followed by carefully controlled dehydration. His notebooks revealed years of experimentation. He had started with animal subjects in 1915, perfecting his techniques on cats and dogs. He documented failure rates, tissue degradation patterns, optimal chemical concentrations. He approached the problem like an engineer, systematically eliminating variables until he achieved the results he desired. By 1920, when he apparently began working with human subjects, his success rate was remarkably high. The bodies found in his collection showed minimal degradation despite being years old, Skin retained its color and texture. Facial features remained recognizable. He had essentially mummified his victims while maintaining their external appearance of life. But why? That was the question that haunted investigators. Marsh clearly wasn't motivated by traditional necrophilia, despite what the press would later sensationalize. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The bodies were treated with an almost reverential care, positioned carefully, dressed in expensive gowns, surrounded by flowers that Marsh replaced regularly. Dr. Harold Weinstein, a psychiatrist from Harvard brought in to evaluate Marsh, proposed that what they were seeing was a profound psychological condition he termed thanatophilic collecting disorder. Marsh, Weinstein theorized, had developed an obsessive need to prevent death, or more accurately, to prevent the visible evidence of death. He couldn't accept decay. He couldn't accept the transformation that death brings to the human form. This was rooted, Weinstein believed, in unresolved childhood trauma. Marsh's mother had died when he was 14, of tuberculosis, a slow, wasting disease that had transformed her physically before his eyes. Young Everett had watched his mother decompose while still living, had seen beauty destroyed by disease. According to Weinstein's analysis, Marsh had spent his entire adult life trying to solve the problem his mother's death had represented: how to preserve beauty against the assault of time and biology. Catherine Marsh's death in 1924 appeared to have been the triggering event that accelerated his collecting. Investigators exhumed Catherine's body and discovered that she had been preserved with the same meticulous care as the other victims, though she remained in her grave rather than in Marsh's collection. Marsh's grief, already pathological, had apparently transformed into a compulsion to save others from the fate that had taken both his mother and his wife. But the preservation was only part of the horror. As investigators continued their examination of the underground chambers, they discovered Marsh's record-keeping extended beyond simple documentation. He had created elaborate histories for each of his subjects, fictional biographies that described their lives, their personalities, their dreams. He had written these as if the women were still alive, still conscious, still part of his household. In one journal entry from 1926, Marsh wrote, "Margaret seems content today. I've positioned her near the window so she can see the autumn light filtering down. She always loved autumn, or so I imagine. I've given her a book to read, though of course she cannot turn the pages. Perhaps tomorrow I'll read to her." This delusion, this creation of imaginary relationships with his preserved victims, suggested a level of psychological fracture that went beyond simple criminal behavior. Marsh had constructed an entire alternate reality in those underground rooms, where he was the benevolent curator of a household of women who would never age, never leave, never reject him. The revelation of these journals created an ethical dilemma for investigators. How much should be revealed to the families of the victims? How much of Marsh's delusional thinking should become public record? These weren't just women who had been murdered. They had been transformed in death into characters in Marsh's private fantasy, given fictional personalities and histories that had nothing to do with who they actually were. When Sarah Holloway was finally able to give her statement to authorities in April 1928, her testimony provided the only first-hand account of what it was like to be inside Dr. Marsh's world. Her words, preserved in court transcripts, are almost unbearably difficult to read. Sarah had known Dr. Marsh professionally. He had lectured at the hospital where she was training, and he had a reputation as an excellent teacher, patient with students, willing to share his extensive knowledge. When she received his note asking if she would be interested in helping catalogue his medical collection, she was flattered. This was an opportunity to learn from one of the most respected physicians in Vermont. She arrived at the mansion on the evening of March 12th, around 7 o'clock. Marsh greeted her cordially, offered her tea, showed her the main floor of his collection. Everything seemed normal. He was the same professional, knowledgeable physician she had encountered at the hospital, but then he suggested they view some particularly rare specimens he kept in the basement. Sarah hesitated, feeling a vague discomfort she couldn't quite name. But Marsh was respected, educated, a colleague. She dismissed her unease as foolish. The first basement room seemed innocuous enough. More specimens, more instruments. Marsh explained various techniques of preservation, demonstrated his photographic equipment. He took several photographs of Sarah, claiming he documented all visitors to his collection. This seemed odd, but not alarming. Then he offered her more tea. This was the moment, Sarah later realized, when he drugged her. The tea contained some sedative, something that made her drowsy, confused, unable to resist when Marsh suggested she rest on a nearby examination table. She remembered fragments after that, being moved deeper underground, waking briefly to find herself in a cold room, dressed in unfamiliar clothing. Marsh's voice, gentle and disturbing, explaining that she was going to become part of something beautiful, something eternal. She tried to scream, but the drugs made her vocal cords sluggish, her movements uncoordinated. She remembered the cold, the terrible, penetrating cold of the refrigeration unit. Marsh explaining that hypothermia was essential to the preservation process, that she needed to be brought to near-death temperatures before the chemical infusions could be most effective. He spoke to her as if explaining a routine, medical procedure, as if her terror and confusion were irrelevant details. What saved Sarah was bureaucracy. Sheriff Thornton's investigation, triggered by her landlady's concern, moved faster than Marsh anticipated. He was forced to delay the final stage of his preservation process, the arterial injection that would have killed her, because he was dealing with the sheriff's questions, with the search warrant, with the sudden disruption of his carefully controlled world. Sarah's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, but it came at a terrible personal cost. She had to describe, in open court, the experience of being conscious but unable to resist, of being treated not as a person, but as an object to be perfected through chemical treatment. She had to describe waking periodically in that refrigeration unit, seeing other bodies around her, understanding with horrible clarity what she was meant to become. After the trial, Sarah Holloway left Vermont and never returned. She changed her name, moved to California, and spent the rest of her life trying to forget the 3 days she spent as an unfinished addition to Dr. Everett Marsh's Macabre collection. Her survival was both miraculous and tragic. Miraculous because she was the only one of Marsh's victims to escape. Tragic because she had to live with the knowledge of what happened to the 11 women who came before her, women who weren't lucky enough to have persistent landladies and thorough sheriffs. The trial of Dr. Everett Marsh began in September 1928 and immediately became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country sent reporters to Burlington. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators desperate for admission to what the press called the trial of the century. Marsh pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense team, led by attorney Cornelius Blackwood, argued that no sane person could have committed these acts, that Marsh was clearly suffering from severe mental illness, and that he should be committed to psychiatric care rather than imprisoned. The prosecution, led by Martin Ashford, argued that Marsh's meticulous planning, his careful selection of victims unlikely to be immediately missed, and his systematic concealment of evidence all demonstrated rational thought and criminal intent. A madman doesn't successfully hide 11 murders for 8 years while maintaining a respected professional reputation. Dr. Harold Weinstein, the Harvard psychiatrist, testified for the defense. He described Marsh's thanatophilic collecting disorder, explained the psychological trauma of his mother's death, presented Marsh as a deeply damaged individual who genuinely believed he was preserving beauty rather than destroying lives. but the prosecution called its own psychiatric experts who disagreed fundamentally with Weinstein's assessment. Dr. Marcus Sutherland from Johns Hopkins argued that Marsh's condition, whatever its psychological origins, didn't absolve him of moral and legal responsibility. Marsh understood that what he was doing was wrong. He hid it. He lied about it. He took elaborate precautions to avoid detection. These were not the actions of someone divorced from reality, but rather someone who understood reality perfectly well and chose to violate it. The most damning evidence came from Marsh's own journals. The prosecution read passages aloud where Marsh described his victim selection process, where he evaluated which women would be missed and which wouldn't, where he calculated risks and planned contingencies. This wasn't delusion, this was calculation. Sarah Holloway's testimony effectively ended any possibility of an insanity verdict. When she described Marsh calmly explaining the preservation process to her, speaking to her with medical detachment as he prepared to end her life, the jury saw not insanity, but cold, calculated evil. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on 11 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Marsh to death by hanging, the maximum penalty available under Vermont law at the time. But Everett Marsh would never face that sentence. On the night of October 12, 1928, while awaiting transfer to the state penitentiary, Dr. Marsh vanished from the Burlington County Jail. The circumstances of his escape remain disputed to this day. The official report claimed that Marsh had somehow obtained a key to his cell, overpowered a guard, and fled into the Vermont wilderness, but unofficial accounts suggest something more disturbing. Deputy Harold Keene, who had participated in the original raid on Marsh's mansion, told his family a different story before his death in 1962. According to Keene, Marsh's escape was facilitated from the outside. Someone with significant resources and connections had orchestrated his disappearance. Who and why remained unclear, but Keene believed that Marsh's collection wasn't the work of one man alone. This theory gained credence when investigators discovered a locked safe in Marsh's study that they had initially overlooked. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Correspondence between Marsh and individuals he referred to only by initials. The letters discussed preservation techniques, specimen acquisition, and collection management in coded language that suggested a network of like-minded collectors. Most disturbing was a map found with the letters. It showed locations across New England, marked with symbols. Some locations were crossed out, suggesting they had been compromised or abandoned. Others remained marked, with dates written beside them ranging from 1929 to 1935. Marsh had been planning for the future. He had known that eventually his Burlington collection might be discovered. He had prepared for that contingency. The map suggested he had other locations, other chambers prepared, other opportunities to continue his work. The investigation into these locations began immediately, but it was hampered by Marsh's use of coded references and vague landmarks. Over the following decades, 3 of the marked sites were identified. 2 were abandoned estates with extensive basements, both showing signs of excavation work similar to what Marsh had done in Burlington. The 3rd was a medical facility that had been closed in 1927 amid unrelated financial scandal. But searchers found nothing concrete. No bodies, no preserved collections. Either Marsh had never used these locations, or someone had cleared them before authorities arrived. The latter possibility suggested that whoever helped Marsh escape had also worked to erase evidence of the broader network. Marsh himself was never seen again, at least not under that name. Over the years, numerous sightings were reported. A man matching his description was allegedly seen boarding a ship to Europe in 1929. Another report placed him in Montreal in 1932. A physician using the name Dr. Edward Morrison and bearing a resemblance to Marsh worked briefly at a hospital in Michigan in 1934, disappearing before authorities could investigate. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. Dr. Everett Marsh had vanished as completely as his victims once had, leaving behind only questions and the horrifying legacy of his Macabre collection. The story of Dr. Everett Marsh should have ended in 1928, but like all truly disturbing cases, it refused to remain buried. Over the following decades, new discoveries and revelations would periodically resurface, each one adding another layer to an already complex and horrifying narrative. In 1934, a graduate student named Thomas Whitmore was researching his family history at the Vermont Historical Society when he discovered something unexpected. Thomas was Catherine Marsh's nephew, and he was trying to piece together his aunt's life for a family genealogy project. What he found was a cache of letters Catherine had written to her sister but never sent, hidden in a trunk of her possessions that had been donated to the Historical Society after the scandal. These letters, written between 1920 and 1923, revealed that Catherine had known something was wrong long before Sarah Holloway's disappearance. She wrote about strange sounds from the basement at night, about Everett's increasing obsession with his work, about young women who came to visit and seemed to vanish afterward. But most chilling was a letter dated November 1923. "I fear my husband is not the man I married. I fear he has become something else entirely, but who would believe me? He is Dr. Marsh, respected and admired, and I am merely his wife, merely the woman who should be grateful for the comfort he provides." Catherine had been afraid to speak publicly about her suspicions. In an era when wives were expected to defer to their husbands, particularly husbands of social standing, her concerns would have been dismissed as hysteria or jealousy. So she remained silent, and women continued to disappear. Thomas Whitmore published his findings in 1935, sparking a renewed investigation into Catherine's death. Her body was exhumed and re-examined with more sophisticated forensic techniques. The results suggested that Catherine hadn't died of natural heart failure, as Marsh had claimed. She had been poisoned, slowly over several months, with small doses of digitalis that would have mimicked cardiac symptoms. Catherine Marsh, it appeared, had been her husband's first victim after all. Or perhaps she had threatened to expose him, and he had eliminated that threat in the most clinical way possible. The 1940s brought another revelation, this time from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Sutherland, the Johns Hopkins psychiatrist who had testified against Marsh during the trial, published a memoir in 1947 titled The Minds of Monsters. In it, he revealed something he hadn't mentioned in court. During his evaluation of Marsh, the doctor had told him about a mentor, a professor at Harvard Medical School who had first introduced him to advanced preservation techniques. Sutherland hadn't pursued this lead at the time because his focus was on Marsh's criminal responsibility, not on potential accomplices. But the revelation prompted Harvard to investigate its records from Marsh's student years. What they found was deeply disturbing. Professor Emil Forsheim, who had taught pathology at Harvard from 1895 to 1902, had been dismissed amid accusations of inappropriate handling of cadavers. The official records were vague, but private correspondence discovered in the university archives suggested that Forsheim had been conducting unauthorized experiments on bodies donated to the medical school. He had vanished after his dismissal, and Harvard had quietly erased as much of his legacy as possible to avoid scandal. Everett Marsh had been one of Forsheim's favorite students. His thesis on tissue preservation had been supervised by Forsheim, and the techniques Marsh used in his collection bore striking similarities to methods Vorsheim had published in obscure European medical journals before his disgrace. This discovery suggested that Marsh hadn't invented his macabre practices in isolation. He had been taught, mentored, inducted into a philosophy of death and preservation that treated human bodies as art materials rather than as people deserving dignity. The question then became, how many other students had Vorsheim influenced? How many other collectors might exist, still hidden, still pursuing their grotesque work? The 1950s brought a discovery that would haunt Vermont for decades. In 1956, construction workers breaking ground for a new highway outside Burlington unearthed a buried structure. It was a root cellar from an abandoned farmhouse long forgotten. But inside that cellar they found 3 bodies, preserved in the same manner as Marsh's collection. The bodies were identified as women who had disappeared from Burlington between 1913 and 1917, years before. Marsh's documented crimes began, but the preservation techniques were unmistakably his. This meant either Marsh had been collecting victims even earlier than investigators knew, or someone else with similar methods had been operating in the same area. The renewed investigation discovered property records showing that the abandoned farm had been owned by Jonathan Marsh, Everett's father, until his death in 1915. The root cellar had been built in 1912, ostensibly for food storage, but its depth and construction suggested it had always been intended for something else. Had Jonathan Marsh been a collector too? Had Everett learned from his father? Or had the young Everett begun his experiments while still living in his father's house, using the farm's isolation to practice the techniques he would later perfect in Burlington? These questions remained unanswered. Jonathan Marsh had died of pneumonia in 1915, apparently a natural death, though by this point investigators trusted nothing. About the Marsh family history, Everett had inherited the farm but sold it in 1918, claiming he needed to focus on his Burlington practice. Perhaps he had simply needed a fresh location, a place not associated with his early experiments. The most unsettling discovery came in 1978, exactly 50 years after Marsh's trial. The sealed court records were finally opened to researchers, revealing testimony and evidence that had been deemed too disturbing for public consumption in 1928. Among these records was a transcript of a private conversation between Marsh and Dr. Weinstein, his defense psychiatrist. In that conversation, Marsh had described something he called the Society of Eternal Beauty, a network of collectors spread across North America and Europe. According to Marsh, these individuals shared techniques, traded specimens, and believed they were preserving what nature sought to destroy. Marsh claimed the society dated back to the mid-1800s, growing out of Victorian death, culture, and anatomical collecting. He named names, though most were dead by 1978 or impossible to verify. But he described locations, procedures, and a philosophy that suggested his crimes were part of something far larger than the actions of one disturbed physician. Investigators who followed up on these claims found tantalizing hints, but no concrete proof. Several of the individuals Marsh named had indeed been physicians or anatomists with controversial reputations. Some had been associated with scandals involving cadaver theft or unethical experiments. But whether they were truly part of an organized network or simply products of an era with looser ethical standards remained unclear. What was clear was that the Marsh case had exposed a darkness that Vermont and perhaps America had preferred to keep hidden. The intersection of medical science, death culture, and individual obsession had created conditions where someone like Everett Marsh could operate for years without detection. By the 1980s, new forensic techniques allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the original case. DNA analysis, not available in 1928, was applied to materials from Marsh's laboratory. The results suggested that his collection included remains from at least 15 individuals, not the 11 documented in his guest book. 4 women had been erased from history so completely that even Marsh hadn't bothered to record them. Who they were, where they came from, why they merited less documentation than the others, nobody knows. They remain anonymous to this day, known only through genetic markers and bone analysis. The Marsh mansion was demolished in 1945, locals believing it was cursed. The property remained vacant for decades, eventually becoming a parking lot for a shopping center. But even now, stories persist. Construction workers report finding chambers they hadn't expected. Groundskeepers describe cold spots and strange sounds. Whether these are genuine phenomena or the power of suggestion fed by the property's history, nobody can say with certainty. As we reach the end of this investigation, we're left with more questions than answers. The case of Dr. Everett Marsh forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the limits of detection, and the vulnerability of those society chooses not to protect. 3 primary theories have emerged over the decades to explain Everett Marsh and his macabre collection. The first theory suggests that Marsh was a profoundly mentally ill individual, someone whose childhood trauma combined with professional access to create a perfect storm of pathology. His mother's death, his isolation, his immersion in the study of death, all contributed to a psychological break that transformed legitimate scientific interest into criminal obsession. According to this theory, Marsh was more patient than criminal, someone who needed treatment rather than punishment. His escape and disappearance might have been orchestrated by sympathetic colleagues who believed he was insane and deserved medical care rather than execution. The second theory argues that Marsh was a calculating psychopath who used his medical credentials as camouflage for predatory behavior. He deliberately selected vulnerable victims. He meticulously planned his crimes. He maintained a public persona specifically to deflect suspicion. His journals and philosophical writings about preservation were post hoc justifications, ways of framing his crimes as something noble to avoid confronting his own monstrosity. According to this theory, his escape was planned in advance, another example of his careful preparation and his belief that he was too intelligent to be permanently stopped. The third theory, perhaps the most disturbing, suggests that Marsh was part of a larger network, that his claims about the Society of Eternal Beauty were true. This theory holds that there were, and perhaps still are, collectors like Marsh, operating in secret, sharing techniques and philosophy, protecting each other when exposure threatens. Marsh's escape was orchestrated by this network, and he continued his work elsewhere under a different identity. The map found in his safe wasn't aspirational but operational, showing sites already prepared by other members of the society. Which theory is correct? Perhaps all 3 contain elements of truth. Marsh was undoubtedly mentally disturbed, but his disturbance didn't prevent him from functioning as a criminal predator. He operated alone in Burlington, but he may have learned from others and taught others in turn. Evil is rarely simple, and the most disturbing cases are often those where multiple factors converge. What we know for certain is this: at least 15 women died because one man decided his desire to preserve beauty outweighed their right to live. They were young women with dreams and families and futures that were stolen from them. They became objects in a collection, stripped of their identities and reduced to specimens in a grotesque gallery. We know that Sarah Holloway survived, but spent the rest of her life shadowed by 3 days of horror. We know that communities across New England mourned daughters and sisters who vanished, never knowing what had become of them until 1928 brought terrible closure. We know that Catherine Marsh lived for years with a monster, trapped by social convention and fear, silenced by an era that didn't believe women's concerns about their husbands. We know that multiple systems failed, that warning signs were ignored, that respect for social position blinded authorities to evidence that should have prompted investigation years earlier. And we know that somewhere, whether in an unmarked grave or living under an assumed name until natural death finally claimed him, Everett Marsh took his final secrets with him. The full extent of his collection, the names of his mentors and students, the truth about the Yai, Society of Eternal Beauty, all of this remains hidden in the shadows of history. To this day, when construction projects in northern Vermont unearth unexpected chambers or sealed rooms, there's a moment of dread before investigation begins. Could this be another site? Could Marsh's work extend even further than known? So far, no new collections have been definitively linked to him, but the possibility remains. The case remains officially open. The FBI maintains a file on Everett Marsh, hoping that modern techniques might someday identify the 4 anonymous victims or locate evidence of his post-escape activities. Amateur investigators periodically examine the map found in his safe, trying to decode his symbols and identify the unmarked sites. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Marsh case is what it revealed about the fragility of civilization's veneer. Here was a respected professional, a pillar of his community, hiding in plain sight while committing atrocities in his basement. He was invited to dinner parties. He lectured to medical students. He signed death certificates and testified in court. And all the while, he was building his collection of the dead. It forces us to ask, how many other monsters are hiding behind professional credentials? How many respected individuals are engaged in horrors that would shatter their communities if exposed? And most disturbing of all, are we looking carefully enough at those who seem above suspicion? Now I want to hear from you, our haunted community. What do you think happened to Dr. Everett Marsh? Do you believe he was part of a larger network, or was he an isolated predator? Do you think his other collection sites exist, still hidden, waiting to be discovered? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you found this investigation compelling, if you want to continue exploring the darkest corners of American history with us, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. We have more forgotten cases to examine, more sealed archives to open, more questions to ask about the monsters who walk among us. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Vermont's darkest secrets. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who appear most respectable. This is your host, signing off from the archives. Stay safe out there.